is Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy, the art of attracting, acquiring, and retaining talent. Here's Kathleen.
Welcome back to my conversation with Eileen Rogers, the founder of One Creative View. We've been talking about how she helps entrepreneurs transform themselves and their businesses. Eileen, I want to get into another issue that companies are dealing with right now, and that's retention. We all know people leave managers, not companies. So in the work that you're doing, what have you found are some of the barriers to creating a healthy workplace?
I do some work. I was trained by Dr. Brené Brown, the author of Dare to Lead. And she was groundbreaking in her research in terms of talking about leadership. And as it relates to retention, why do people not connect with their manager or their leader? And how do we have more courageous leaders? So lots of research she put together. She came up with 10 things that sort of happen when you don't have courageous leaders. One, people leave, right? But even beyond that, what happens in the culture? And the first, with no close second whatsoever, is that people avoid tough conversations. And we avoid them not because we want to be nice. We avoid them because they make us uncomfortable. Speaking the truth feels like we're being unkind, especially when we share difficult information or feedback. But the reality is, if you're working in an organization and your manager isn't giving you feedback to help you grow, they're basically setting you up just to leave. You're not going to be inspired, you're not learning, and you're not going to be fulfilled. And my understanding is people have less tolerance for that now. So managers need to really think about the culture that they create. Is it brave? Some of the other reasons, even though, again, avoiding and not having these tough conversations, do you have a culture of perfectionism and fear that stops people from learning and growing? How much as a manager are you portraying perfectionism? A lot of us felt like that was the way we needed to lead, right? It was sort of command and control, and I have to have all the answers. I have to be perfect. Future leaders are going to have some of those soft skills you talked about. And number one in my mind is curiosity. Curiosity, calm. They need to be able to create connection, be able to have empathy, and really, I guess what I would call just more of a coaching leadership style. And that's going to impact your retention. In the companies that I work with, even beyond yours, retention is the number one factor. And it is because in some cases, there's this age difference and expectation between people like me who came through with this older idea of what leadership was and what the people coming into the workforce now and younger workers expect. It's just a big difference.
Yeah, a very big difference. Another thing for us to all keep learning on. You mentioned Brené Brown, and you are one of a limited number of certified Dare to Lead facilitators. And I know that you are extremely passionate about growing more courageous and daring leaders. And you wrote an article and shared it with our organization recently called Risking the Heart of Daring Leadership. Are we too polite for honest discourse? And you kick off this article by saying, vulnerability is not a concept I learned in business school, nor, for that matter, theories about soft skills such as self-awareness, risk, emotional IQ, shame, or courageous leadership. Yet for today's leader to be relevant, effective, and impactful, these ideas must become part of our everyday vocabulary and being. And this can be pretty painful for some leaders. It was not easy for us. But one of your core values, as you've just alluded to, is courage. So talk to us some more about how you help leaders become more courageous.
It starts with self-awareness, right? And working with someone who can help you identify, because we all have them, limiting beliefs. What gets in our way? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it some belief I don't deserve this? For most of us, the number one belief internally, really deep down, is I'm not enough. And so being courageous from this perspective means digging in to all of those things that we've accumulated somewhere. Imposter syndrome, all of those kinds of issues are important to just be talking about it. I never thought that vulnerability, the word alone, because that certainly wasn't how I was raised. I was very armored, that we'd be talking about it in the workplace and that we would look for it in leaders. And I think what's important is to understand what is vulnerability. It's risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. It's not squishy. It's not something just women do. It is something that leaders face every single day, multiple times a day. So risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And it ties back into what's your definition, if you will, of a leader and a good leader. And so doing some exploration into that, as we did in your group a month or so ago, there is no one definition of a leader that everybody has. And so it's important to understand for you what's important in terms of leadership.
And I think that it's interesting because that has been, kind of like to your point in the beginning of our conversation, this is what I thought I had to be, right? Yeah. And this is, and I, and you know this about me, I had the same thing, and I had a lot of self-doubt about myself as a person who could lead an organization, because I didn't think that I was smart enough, or I hadn't had the right corporate pedigree behind that. And recently I was on a panel with two other women, and I kind of felt like they were more like boasting about their accomplishments and whatnot. And again, I'm a little older than they are too, but I remember at the end of the session, one of the people made a comment about my nonverbals to both of these women, in being more kind and nodding and encouraging them. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because while I was trying to communicate that to them, that, okay, you're doing a good job, it came across. And so that was kind of an awareness journey for me from a leadership perspective, and was pleased to see that these young people picked up on it.
Yeah, it's great. There are so many opportunities to mentor, if you will, or coach, or just show up for people in a really positive way. And often it starts with a little bit of vulnerability, right? And I realize now, after 40 years in business, I joke about I've made just about every mistake that you could make in business, some of them more than once when I forgot them. But that sometimes those are the most important things you can share with people. And, in the early part of my career, I was so frightened people would find me out. I didn't belong there. I didn't know what I was doing. All of those stories we tell ourselves. And it was funny, as I was thinking about this podcast, it brought me back to, at 13 years in my career, after I finally bought out my first partner, I was kind of like, now what, right? That was the journey and what I was working so hard for, and I did it. And then it was, now what? And I ended up calling 5 businesswomen who were on the cover of today's Arizona Woman, and people that you heard about that were so successful. And I called each of them and asked them to lunch. And, I asked them to tell me their story, but their hardship story. What were the tough things they had to go through? Because it was so great to hear that it just wasn't all this glitz that you see in social media and what was on there. And it was so validating for me. Okay, I'm not alone. And if you use self-compassion from Kristen Neff, there are 3 elements to it. And one of them is common humanity, which is I'm not alone. Somebody had mortgaged her house to have her business and thought they were going to lose it. And, talking to somebody who had to let someone who was in their 70s with cancer go. And just hard stories about being in business. And people were willing to be vulnerable with me. And it was so appreciated and so meaningful.
Yeah, I think many of us have gotten the MBA from that school of hard knocks.
On the job training, yes.
Yes, yep. So let's talk about a really fun topic, conflict at work. Not that is anything personal, but you've shared a lot with me in the past, and sometimes conflict at work arises when we feel like we've been treated wrongly, and it can be a result of a variety of different things, from just that our feelings are hurt, or we're embarrassed, we're offended. Most of all, like, we're just angry, right? These responses are the result of when somebody's actions, right, or maybe even, as you say, lack of action, contrasts with what we believe should have happened. And I think the operative word is should have. Should. So whenever the source of whatever that source of conflict is, we know we can't truly resolve it or move on unless we let go of whatever that is, the hurt, the anger, the fear. And that process of letting go and what's needed in order to move on in one's life. And you work a lot with organizations and with individuals on this. So, what are some of the ways that we can let go of these things that should have happened and move on?
I think it's a really great question, and it happens in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives. It's almost like any other situation you have. You have to identify what's the challenge, what's the right problem that you're dealing with. So being emotionally hijacked means you have no access to your prefrontal cortex. You don't have rational thought. And so first of all, calming down to sort of get some distance from that emotion so you can bring back in and say, what's the story I'm telling myself here? Because what our brain does is it has us make up stories, good guys, bad guys, and then we believe our stories to be the truth. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that what you're operating from is pretty much a story, no judgment with it, just a story. It's figuring out, okay, I have a story with this person. Maybe they're going to have their own version, their story. Most of us get stuck in being right. My story is correct or your story is correct. And if the opportunity is really to move forward, it's to acknowledge that we both own these stories, but see if you're aligned in moving forward. Can we move forward and create some new boundaries so that we can both live in integrity and make the most generous assumptions about intent? That's actually a Dare to Lead concept called living big. What boundaries, what's okay, what's not okay, need to be in place so that we can live in our integrity and maintain generous assumptions about people's intent and actions.
I wish it were that easy.
I know.
Another thing that we hear a lot of today, I think more so than in the past, is about building a psychologically safe workplace. As I have been reading more about this over the last few years, it's apparent that the most successful organizations that are constantly innovating, that their secret sauce seems to be building that psychologically safe work environment where everyone feels that they're included and they can contribute and it's safe to learn and they can be vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And the best gauge of psychological safety is to ask this question: can we take risks on this team without feeling insecure or embarrassed? So how would you coach a leader who answered that question by saying no, or maybe even worst case said, I don't know?
obviously we want to keep digging deeper, right, to figure out what's there. And I do want to qualify, psychological safety is a term that everyone is using now. There's a misconception that it's a place we get to and then we stay there. And literally every time somebody new joins an organization, you kind of start over. And that challenger safety is where the innovation, where the creativity and everything happens. So I think that's important to realize that it's an ongoing process, the psychological safety. So in terms of helping somebody establish it, I think identifying which of those phases they're stuck in could be helpful. There are 4 distinct phases to psychological safety, but really, like everything else, figuring out what is the real challenge here, what's the right problem to solve, what's in the way, and not guessing, and really having those kind of tough conversations to dig in, and really come from this place of curiosity and calm and empathy and figure out what's not there. I think about being a business owner and how many times, honestly, I wasted time guessing instead of having conversations and asking people directly. Because in a sense, that honors their integrity. Most of us know what's working or what isn't working. And I don't know isn't an answer that as a coach you take. You can literally say, if you did know, what would it be? And just helping people really dig deeper to figure out what's going on. What do we need to address here?
And I think that, I know for me, I always struggled and was not taught how to be curious. And so, and maybe that's my 2 also, but I've really been working hard on how to be more curious because as a 2, we are the considerate helper, and it's much easier for me to tell you the solution as opposed to ask curiosity questions and help you to come to the solution instead of me telling you.
Right. And just remember, without judgment, those are simply habits and patterns. And so this really ties into what does a future leader look like? And it is the person with the curiosity. And the best way to think about this is if you are of the mind that you have to have all the answers, if you're really busy and just telling somebody or giving advice or doing those kinds of things is there, you're basically disempowering them at some level. And the idea is if you disempower them, you as a leader are going to have more on your plate. And so asking questions is helpful because people, when they own their answer, and coaching, the foundation of coaching is that we believe the answer is within you, that you're 100% whole. And our goal is to help you uncover what's there. It's not to give advice and it's not to tell you what to do. So the same thing applies to a coaching leadership style. So how can we best, like you said, go through this? Can you ask that person if they'd like some help with it? Can you ask them what they've thought should happen first? I mean, they're simple, small things, but you'll empower people every day when you do it.
And I was speaking with a group of college students a couple weeks ago, and they were asking, what are 1 or 2 skills that, we should be really focusing on. And the other person in the group was like, conflict resolution. This is going to help you in life. And I said, learn how to be curious, stay curious, ask questions, because then it'll drive everything else. And I don't think they hear that very often.
Probably not, because there aren't many of us, and not many of the types are really comfortable with conflict. A few are more comfortable than others. But the term Brene Brown uses is a rumble. And it sounds a little bit better maybe than conflict, but a rumble is simply a discussion, a conversation, a meeting, and there are 6 elements to it. The first is everyone's committed to lean into vulnerability. Everyone's committed to staying curious and using generous assumptions. 3 is everybody is committed to staying in that sort of messy stage of problem identification before we start solving and discussing. 4, if it gets out of hand or we get tired, we're going to take a break and we'll circle back. And then the 5th element is really important. It's about being fearless around owning our own part in whatever that situation is. I guess it ties back to vulnerability. And 6 is really important. This is a skill of listening with the same passion with which we want to be heard. And most of us, if we're hijacked emotionally, we listen until the person finishes, and then we go ahead with what it is. And so truly one of the gifts you can share with your team as a leader is genuinely listening to them in the way in which you'd like to be heard. So all the elements to a rumble are really about curiosity, and then they're also about that moment every day when you get to choose courage over comfort or even resentment.
Yes, yes.
And you were exactly right with your panel. The more we can get comfortable with rumbling and being vulnerable, the more opportunity there is to be connected.
Absolutely. And one of the many things that you have taught me, Eileen, you talked about your passion for travel at the top of our conversation, and you have had an enviable ability to blend travel, family, mentorship, feminist advocacy into your life and meaning. So when did you start developing that balance?
Great question. I think about growing up, and I think about how creative we had to be, really about adapting and evolving. I think I had 18 jobs before I graduated from college, and so it was very comfortable for me to pivot, to adapt. And early on, when I started working, like you, insane hours, I think I even slept at my store one night. It was a long time ago. I started to realize or feel empowered that I could create things. I mean, I was the boss. Nobody was telling me what to do. I realized that, okay, I would try to fit this in. I would practice something. I would do something. And really, I spent 8 months backpacking in Europe, and it was transformational in my life. I learned about who I was and all kinds of things. So it wasn't, I just like to travel. It was infused in my soul after that trip. So it was important to me. This is the idea of being a creator. So if you're willing to be vulnerable, to be courageous, to step up, to ask for what you want and what you need, and then take that further step into how can I create it? That really impacted me. And then there were also a couple people that I was fortunate to know, and unfortunately, they passed away very early in their lives. And they were people who had all kinds of dreams for when I want to retire, or, it's someday I'm going to get to this and I'm going to do that. And that also really impacted me. Early on, when I moved to Scottsdale, I mentored with Mayor Herb Drinkwater. And he was another example of someone who retired, and within 6 months, he had passed away. And so I didn't want that to be a part of my life. And I was able to, as an entrepreneur, to weave in community service and having an impact, to connect with the travel. The travel was kind of funny. My original business partner used to be somewhat resentful of my travel. And so therefore, I didn't call back, because whenever I called back, he would complain about all kinds of things. And I thought, well, that didn't make any difference anyway. So I thought, you'll be just fine without me. Call me if the building burns down. And I said, no, don't call me anyway. There's nothing I can do, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea of I wasn't that important, right? I could create it. And then at one point, I had a friend who had challenged me to say, if you were going to leave your business for 60 days, what would you need to put in place? And it was really intriguing to think about it. And, for you as another entrepreneur, what would you need to know? What would need to happen or put in place so that you could go? And so it's just a different way of thinking. And I've been incredibly fortunate. I also don't have children. I have a big dog, so that makes a big difference in terms of my freedom and flexibility to travel. But we do get to create our lives. They don't always work out in the way in which we think we're going to create them. But being fully present and involved versus letting the world happen to us has always been part of my experience.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, and I guess sometimes it's better that it doesn't pan out the way that we had scripted it, because the scavenger hunt is far more fun, and you meet so many wonderful people along the way.
Yes. And, all the things that I've learned over the years in terms of business and life, not all of them were pleasant in the moment, right? And so understanding, as Brene says, that we're going to walk into the arena, sometimes we're going to get our butt kicked, and then we just pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, figure out what we learned, and then we keep moving.
Yep. And that takes some practice. Well, Eileen, it's been a great conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. For those listeners that are interested in connecting with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can go to my website, which is onecreativeview, all spelled out.com, and there's contact information there. That's probably the easiest way. Or connect with me on LinkedIn.
Well, I definitely recommend everyone check out your website, especially to stay in touch and keep track of your crazy adventures like skydiving.
Yes, I am the typical type 7 Enneagram, the adventurer. I fit the profile too.
Thanks again, Eileen. It's been great having you on the podcast.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen.
You're welcome. And that's it for this episode of Revolutionizing Recruitment. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you'll automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left me a review so more folks like yourself can discover the show. Until next time, take care.
This has been Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy. To connect with Kathleen or to learn more about recruitment research, go to duffygroup.com.